In our previous video, we provided a brief overview of the TOEFL listening section, including the 8 basic question types that will be asked on the test. We also began exploring the conversations passage, including examining the strategies, hints, and tricks involved with this part of the test. In our video today, we will begin to look at the lectures portion of the listening section. Lectures can last anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, most likely around 5 minutes, and generally will have, again, around 6 or so questions asked with each passage. Now, as mentioned in the previous video, we looked kind of briefly at the 8 question types, especially in relation to the actual listening passage. Now, a lot of the lecture sections will come from all 3 of the categories here. This is a little bit different from the conversations passage, which generally focus more on sort of the basic comprehension and pragmatic understanding questions. However, with some of the lectures, you will also see more information about how to connect ideas, and perhaps we'll explore this in the next video as well. So let's discuss the basic features of an academic lecture. First off, we know that professors generally lecture on specific academic topics in a classroom. So, for example, instead of just saying World War II, he or she might be discussing a particular battle at any time in a class. The organization of a lecture is very similar to that of a reading passage. We'll explore more of that today. And you will notice that different parts of the lecture will be repeated to focus on more specific information. This is referred to as the pragmatic understanding, or often the replay question. Now, again, much like we saw in the reading section and in the previous conversations listening passage, cohesion will once again play a part in understanding how information is organized. And we're going to look at that very carefully throughout this video. First off, to think about in cohesion, we look at signal words. What types of signal words do professors use? How does the professor restate, rephrase, or, as we will see today, even repeat information to help information stick together? And does the professor use any sort of reference ideas to show how information might relate to previously stated ideas? Now, in terms of solving academic lectures, the general idea here is very similar to what we discussed in our previous video. Can we recognize signal words that are more common in speaking contexts? Thinking about other spoken conventions that indicate where important concepts are given. And I think also thinking about how lectures are generally organized, especially on the test. Now, as we mentioned in the previous video too, note-taking is permitted. So part of the challenge, just like it is in any part of the listening section, but especially so with the lecture, it's really focusing on the ability to capture all of the important information in really one listening. And that's going to be very difficult. Lectures are fairly long, and they do include a lot of ideas. So oftentimes students have difficulty following the passages. Now, in this video, we're trying to learn how to take notes. So you will notice we'll be listening to the passage more than once and analyzing information to help us identify what's important and which parts are maybe not so important. Now, as stated before in our previous video, it's impossible to transcribe every word we hear, and that would not even be a good idea because you'll miss some information if you try to seek something word for word. So our goal is to actively process information that we hear and trying to put it in the information together in the order that you hear it. Now this brings us to our first TOEFL strategy, a process we're going to call active listening. Now first off, active listening is pretty much very similar to active reading, which is what we discussed in the reading video series. It's really talking about how we can become more involved with the information as we're given. So, again, when thinking about the reading section, we have to really be engaged, involved, and much of the success with active listening really will depend on the ability to recognize those various cohesive devices that are used in this part of the test. So keep in mind, our goal is to think about how is active listening different from active reading? Well, part of it is thinking about how that information is organized and delivered in a spoken way rather than a written way. So first off, we have to think about in terms of taking notes, we have to be efficient and concise. Concise means shorter, so that we'll be more effective in this case. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later throughout the video. Now, the first thing to consider, really, just like we discussed in the reading section, we really have to think about how information's organized. So let's think about these sort of following questions even before we listen. How do ideas and concepts connect to each other in a lecture? How do we know if the speaker is talking about a new topic or is still talking about the previous one? And how much does the actual genre, genre again refers to the kind of type of the lecture, play a part in the overall organization of the passage? Now let's look at these a little more in detail. So what we're going to think about is, what are some genre considerations of the topic of this listening passage? Well, in our example today, the listening passage involves theater history. So let's think about, just for a moment, what are some things we need to think about? We should always think about first, what do we already know? Do we know much about the theater? Have we seen a play? Have we studied anything about the history of theater before? We should also think about how such passages are going to be organized. Now, most of the lectures on the TOEFL follow a fairly similar general organization, but it's also important to think about the specific ideas, how they're going to be organized in this particular area. Now, first off, when we think about history, we usually seem to think about time signals, or even things in a certain sequence. But we also notice that the word theater is involved, and theater usually involves the arts. Now, a lot of discussions of arts involve the evolution of ideas, how one particular generation or previous generation influences perhaps a more recent one. So again, perhaps we might see something to compare or contrast. So again, this is part of the idea of the organization. Could we see a little of both history and theater involved? And then we also have to think about the specific point. So keep in mind, theater history, of course, is a very broad topic. So what exactly will we learn here? What specific concepts and our time period? Perhaps we'll be looking at maybe the Renaissance, for example. Are we looking at a particular country in terms of their development of theater history? So the idea here is we'll be discussing people, ideas. That's something we need to think about. It probably will not be some very broad exploration. It'll probably involve some specific idea. Now, in order for us to be successful, we really need to think about how the actual passage is going to be organized. So you will notice how the TOEFL really does organize this information in a very efficient way. So the first thing we need to do is really pay attention to the very beginning of the listening passage. Why is that important? Well, part of it is a lot of the genre considerations we've been discussing will probably be answered within the first 30 or 60 seconds. So we'll have a pretty clear idea as to how the passage is going to be organized and what the main topic will probably be. Now, we're going to start just by listening to the first 30 seconds. In this case, I will play some questions, the genre consideration questions, on the screen again. Now, as you listen, see if you can find the answers to them. And then in a moment, we will analyze the transcript and verify those answers. So on the left side here, I have those genre questions. Now, obviously, we can't answer the first one. Only you can answer that one as to how much you already know about this topic. So as you start to listen, think about, what do I already know, as the professor begins to talk. As we listen too, think about the types of organizations we thought we would hear. Are we going to hear some time? Are we going to hear some comparison or sequence, or perhaps even an explanation of ideas? It's possible we might hear a lot of these. And then we can kind of identify, too, what will be the specific point of the lecture. Is it just going to be, again, theater history in general, or what are going to be the specific ideas? So now, just take a moment and get ready to listen, and I will leave the questions on the screen. See if you think you can find the answers to these questions. The 19th century was the time that we saw what we call realism develop in the European theater. To understand this, though, we first need to look at an earlier form of drama known as the well-made play, which basically was a pattern for constructing plays. Plays that, beginning with some early 19th century comedies in France, proved very successfully commercially. The dramatic devices used here weren't actually anything new. They'd been around for centuries. Okay, now we'll look at the transcript, and we'll highlight the answers after listening to those first 30 seconds. So again, we're going to skip the first question for a moment. That's for you to think about how much you already know about this particular topic. So again, think about right at the beginning, we get the idea that this is in the 19th century. Do you know anything about 19th century theater history? Are you familiar with the European theater? These are some things that you can think about. But let's move on. So, what are some of the ideas we saw that indicated the types of organization? Now, I'm going to use a color coding system to help kind of make it a little bit easier to find. So, first off, we'll talk about the organization in red. So, what ideas do we see in the transcript that indicate how it's going to be organized? Well, notice again, we do have some time elements. We see the words 19th century, and again, repeated somewhere here at the bottom, 19th century comedies in France. We also see a comparative idea. Notice the concept here, we need to look at something earlier. So we have this idea, but in order to understand this idea, we need to look at something earlier. We need to go back. And then we also recognize that that idea really is not completely new. It's been around for a long time. So notice we have already the introduction to the fact that there's some time sequence involved. We have some information of how we're going to compare from one idea to the next. And we think about how long that information's been around. Now, let's look at the next point, which we'll highlight in green. Can we find out which specific points are going to be discussed? Well, at the beginning, we notice that it starts off with the idea of realism. But then it turns off to something a little bit different. It actually goes back in time to something called the well-made play. And then notice here at the bottom it talks about the particular dramatic devices. So notice we're going to learn the dramatic devices, or the basic concepts that are basically part of the well-made play. So notice within the first 30 to 60 seconds, and here 30 seconds really, to see what kinds of things we can already learn as to what genre considerations are included. And we will probably see a lot of these same patterns and ideas throughout the essay. We can also think about here, especially at the end, how this will point us in the right direction. What are those dramatic devices that we're going to learn about? Well, that's usually the point of a lecture, is to teach us these ideas. Now, as we continue, let's think about some of the common spoken cohesive devices we've already seen, and we're probably going to see throughout the rest of the passage. First off, in more spoken contexts, a lot more common, I think, are the idea of definition signals. And definition signals really tell us how new words or terms are defined, and they will be a little bit different than what we see in a reading context. We will also see a lot of repeated ideas, not just rephrased ideas, but actual repetition of words. That's because in spoken context, it's often hard to just think of new words or new ways to say the same thing. So oftentimes professors just rely on the same words or ideas. Now, of course, we will see some rephrased ideas. This is something that is very common not only in academic environments, but also very common on the TOEFL. We will also see reference ideas. Again, those are ideas, kind of one is pointing back to something they spoke about before. Now, again, on the right side, we have, again, a similar color coding system to kind of illustrate things we see already in the transcript and things we're probably going to see as we continue. So words such as what we call, or something is known as, or even these particular relative pronouns, which was, or that, can help to define and clarify the idea a little bit more. Notice how the professor basically repeats a lot of the same words. In fact, here he repeated the word plays twice, right next to each other. Even 19th century was repeated. And then, of course, notice well-made play will probably be repeated a lot because this is a term that the professor is trying to teach. Rephrased ideas, for example, when they said in Europe and rephrased the idea in France. Now, of course, that's a little bit different than rephrasing it. It's actually more specific, but the two do relate to each other. France, of course, is in Europe. And then finally, reference ideas, which, again, are used a lot in speaking, because obviously sometimes the professor may not necessarily, in order to continue speaking, may use words such as this or these or that instead of just saying this idea. Again, it's very common in spoken context to not necessarily say all of the idea you're rephrasing or referencing. So again, you may hear a lot of thises and these and that's. So in the first 30 to 60 seconds, what we need to think about really is that that's sort of like the introduction to the passage, much like we would have in a reading passage. So as we begin to start thinking about taking notes, it's important to think about this overall organization and how we need to be able to write all of this down in that clear and concise way we mentioned earlier. So think about an active listening. When we discuss some of these pre-listening ideas, and of course even things we do early on, we need to add to the concept, because obviously as we continue to listen, we've got to keep focusing on the information. So how can we continue to capture this information in note form? Well, let's return to the genre considerations we began discussing. So first off, in any academic lecture, we generally will follow a fairly common organizational pattern, and this will not be any different on the TOEFL. So again, the introduction, the first 30 to 60 seconds of the lecture, will kind of serve as the introduction. The main part, or the body of the argument, will be probably the next 4 to 5 minutes. And again, usually the lectures are about 5 minutes in total. And then if there is a conclusion, it's usually going to be the final 10 to 20 seconds. And we will see that pattern play out pretty closely here in the lecture that we're looking at in this video. So, thinking about taking notes, what we're going to do next is we're going to take notes on the introduction and actually write down information. So we're actually going to listen to it again. But before we do that, let's demonstrate a technique that we can use on the test. So take out a piece of paper and divide the paper into 3 parts, and write down the following headings, leaving plenty of space in between each one. Now those headings are going to be the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And it will kind of look like this on a piece of paper. This is similar to what we did in the previous video with the conversations, where we already kind of had some organizational style that would help us in focusing our attention. So, now we're going to listen to the full first 60 seconds. This will, again, what we consider to be the introduction. Now, as you listen, see if you can write down those main ideas and details being given. And really try to pay attention to the different cohesive devices that are being used. Okay, so get ready to take notes under the introduction heading on your paper. The 19th century was the time that we saw what we call realism develop in the European theater. To understand this, though, we first need to look at an earlier form of drama known as the well-made play, which basically was a pattern for constructing plays. Plays that, beginning with some early 19th century comedies in France, proved very successfully commercially. The dramatic devices used here weren't actually anything new. They'd been around for centuries. But the formula for a well-made play required that certain of these elements be included, in a particular order, and, most importantly, that everything in the play be logically connected. In fact, some of these playwrights would start by writing the end of a play and work backward toward the beginning, just to make sure each event led logically from what had gone before. So, here are some sample notes from the introduction. We notice that, again, the introduction begins with talking about realism, which was, again, a common idea in the 19th century Europe. But the idea of the well-made play came before that. Now, the well-made play, as described by the professor, was a kind of provided the pattern of successful plays to come. And, of course, it was successful because they made money. Now, the ideas, though, had been around a long time, and it included certain things that were always needed to make a well-made play. So he called it a formula, something that well-made plays kind of follow, which means they also followed in a certain order, and that they were connected to each other as well. And at the end of the introduction, he talked about using this transition of, in fact, playwrights even started to write their plays from the ending and then wrote backwards to the beginning to make it seem fairly logical. Now again, this is just a summary so far of what we heard, but these were notes that we kind of can take as we go along. Now, first off, notice I didn't use always the exact same words that were used. I kind of actively processed some of the information so that I could understand it. But whenever the professor used words that were basically technical, in other words, brand new, I generally would write those down exactly as I hear them. So this really brings us to this next point, and that's part of the active listening idea of paraphrasing. It's a very important part, and it's something we saw in the reading section as well. But it's far more important, I think, here because we're trying to keep up with information we can't see. So the first thing we need to understand is that paraphrasing really involves taking the important information and putting it on your own words. But we really want to focus only on the key ideas. So it's also knowing when the passage is giving you a new term to learn. So notice, for example, when the professor introduced the term well-made play, basically he kind of used this sort of comparison. He also used a signal to say, well, we had realism, but then we had something else before that. So the idea here is that when he introduced the idea of well-made play, notice how he does it here. Listen again. To understand this, though, we first need to look at an earlier form of drama known as the well-made play, which basically was a pattern for constructing plays. Plays that, beginning with some early 19th century comedies in France, proved very successful commercially. Now, see right away, notice we get this sort of contrast, though. So in order to understand the previous idea, we first need to look at this idea. And then notice how the professor uses a definition signal, an earlier form known as, and then uses other words to kind of clarify it, which was, and a play that. So again, these are the common ways that professors are going to give information in a lecture format. So the purpose of the TOEFL listening passage, and the reading passage as well, is to see if you can demonstrate that ability to learn something new in an academic environment. So it should be your expectation that new ideas and concepts will be introduced and also defined for you throughout the test. So make sure you write them down in your notes, and as well as to list the characteristics that follow. So remember, in trying to capture all of the details, it's really important to use your own words where possible. So that's the idea here. Again, notice I didn't exactly repeat every idea the professor said. But notice here also in my note-taking, under the introduction sort of part of the paper, how I would use, here like in this outline format, if the professor moved to a new idea that was equal to the idea before, I usually kept the words on the same sort of line. But then when I recognized that the professor was describing things about the well-made play, then I moved the information over to the right. Now this is kind of similar to what we can do here on a PowerPoint. So again, as you're taking notes, try to recognize that this information is actually describing the information before it. And then finally, notice how I use the signal in fact as another signal to say, well, we're starting another new idea in the paragraph. So even this simple little format is very helpful to think about when it comes to taking notes. So keep in mind, as we're writing down information, not every detail will be important. So for example, the fact that France was mentioned in the introduction may or may not be important. If we do hear it repeated or rephrased, then we probably should write it down. So in this case, if France is going to be the focus, then maybe we should include that. But I noticed that we're talking about Europe, so France was really just an example of this. So as we get ready to listen to the body, I want to go back and just think for a moment. Did we notice how the professor used a definition signal in the introduction, along with some other techniques common to speaking, to present a new idea? As we get ready to listen to the body, let's pay attention to those various spoken conventions that professors often use to transition from one idea to another. Let's look at some. And what we're going to do here is on the right side, translate those ideas. What exactly do they mean when professors use them? So, for example, professors often use rhetorical questions. So, for example, so why did this happen? It's because sometimes professors repeat or summarize information that was just said. After the something happened, then. So again, notice that probably repeating the same words or summarizing what just was said before. And perhaps even rephrasing key ideas or words immediately after they were said. So, for example, the automobile or car. Now, how can we translate these ideas so we can understand them better? Well, first off, rhetorical questions really don't need an answer from the audience. They're actually just spoken conventions that professors use to get to the next point. So in this case, the professor's asking a point, but he or she will answer it with the next point, not someone from the class. Repeating and summarizing information basically is just saying that we're going to add something to something we said before. So again, these are kind of ways to continue. So think of this as like a continuer to the next idea. And oftentimes these little transition points are much easier to identify when we just repeat the idea before it. And then finally, rephrasing information, especially if we feel like we need to simplify it, oftentimes is the professor saying that we're not sure if the audience understands this word or that this is a key idea. So I will immediately rephrase and or simplify it. So sometimes professors do this because they may be not so sure that the audience understands it or that they really want to emphasize this important word or idea. Now, in addition, there are other things that we do when speaking. For example, pauses, hesitations, and changes in pitch, either rising or falling, can also signal a change from one idea to another. Now, notice in this example. So, why did he do this? Notice how I used a pause in between the word or the utterance and the word why. Then, of course, I hesitated a little bit as well. And then notice how my pitch kind of rose to indicate that this is a rhetorical question. Well, all of these can be used to emphasize the fact that perhaps the professor is summarizing or concluding information as well. Look at this next example. And that, that is why this happened. So notice again, we paused, hesitated, and perhaps went up a little bit. Well, notice the change in intonation there helps to kind of signal that this professor is trying to think or try to connect information and sort of maybe even prepare the audience for what's coming next. So, another thing to keep in mind, though, is that the TOEFL is actually trying to help you as well. As the professor transitions to each point, watch how the screen changes. So try to pay attention to the screen while you're listening as well. Now we're going to get ready to listen, and we're going to continue now with the body. So now make sure to take notes in the body section as you listen to this part of the lecture. Okay, so what are the necessary elements of a well-made play? Well, the first is logical exposition. Exposition is whatever background information you have to reveal to the audience, so they'll understand what's going on. Before this time, exposition might have come from actors simply giving speeches. Someone might walk out on a stage and say, "In fair Verona, where we lay our scene," and then tell all about the feuding families of Romeo and Juliet. But for the well-made play, even the exposition had to be logical, believable. So, for example, you might have two servants gossiping as they're cleaning the house, and one says, "Oh, what a shame the master's son is still not married." And the other might mention a rumor about a mysterious gentleman who's just moved into town with his beautiful daughter. These comments are part of the play's logical exposition. The next key element of a well-made play is referred to as the inciting incident. After we have the background information, we need a key moment that gets things moving, that really makes the audience interested in what happens to the characters we just heard about. So, for example, after the two servants reveal all this background information, we meet the young man, just as he first lays eyes on the beautiful young woman and immediately falls in love. This is the inciting incident. It sets off the plot of the play. Now, the plot of a well-made play is usually driven by secrets, things that the audience knows, but the characters often don't know. So, for example, the audience learns through a letter or through someone else's conversation who this mysterious gentleman is, and why he left the town many years before. But the young man doesn't know about this, and the woman doesn't understand the ancient connection between her family and his. And before the secrets are revealed to the main characters, the plot of the play proceeds as a series of up and down moments. For example, the woman first appears not even to notice the young man, and it seems to him like the end of the world. But then he learns that she actually wants to meet him, and wants to meet him too. So life is wonderful. Then if he tries to talk with her, maybe her father gets furious for no apparent reason. So they can't see each other. But just as the young man has almost lost all hope, he finds out, well, you get the idea. The reversals of fortune continue, increasing the audience tension and excitement, making them wonder if everything's going to come out okay or not. Next comes an element known as the obligatory scene. It's a scene, a moment in which all the secrets are revealed, and generally things turn out well for the hero and others we care about. A happy ending of some sort. This became so popular that a playwright almost had to include it in every play, which is why it's called the obligatory scene. And that's followed by the final dramatic element, the denouement, or the resolution, when all the loose ends have to be tied up in a logical way. Remember, the obligatory scene gives the audience emotional pleasure, but the denouement offers the audience a logical conclusion. That's the subtle distinction we need to try very hard to keep in mind. So, as mentioned before we listen to the lecture, we need to pay attention to the screen. Since the TOEFL is trying to present what actually happens in a university classroom, it's pretty important to notice how the test is helping us here by putting this information on the screen. Several of the key terms the professor was describing was placed on the chalkboard on the screen. These are ideas that you must write down, and you must be prepared to listen for their definitions and explanations. You can be certain that they will use some, if not all, of these terms in the questions that will follow. Now, we're going to listen one more time, this time to the whole lecture. The goal here is to focus on the entire lecture, listening to the conclusion as well. See if you can identify the conclusion as you're listening. So at this point, focus on adding more details to what you already have. The 19th century was the time that we saw what we call realism develop in the European theater. To understand this, though, we first need to look at an earlier form of drama known as the well-made play, which basically was a pattern for constructing plays. Plays that, beginning with some early 19th century comedies in France, proved very successfully commercially. The dramatic devices used here weren't actually anything new. They'd been around for centuries. But the formula for a well-made play required that certain of these elements be included, in a particular order, and, most importantly, that everything in the play be logically connected. In fact, some of these playwrights would start by writing the end of a play and work backward toward the beginning, just to make sure each event led logically from what had gone before. Okay, so what are the necessary elements of a well-made play? Well, the first is logical exposition. Exposition is whatever background information you have to reveal to the audience, so they'll understand what's going on. Before this time, exposition might have come from actors simply giving speeches. Someone might walk out on a stage and say, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, and then tell all about the feuding families of Romeo and Juliet. But for the well-made play, even the exposition had to be logical, believable. So, for example, you might have two servants gossiping as they're cleaning the house, and one says, "Oh, what a shame the master's son is still not married." And the other might mention a rumor about a mysterious gentleman who's just moved into town with his beautiful daughter. These comments are part of the play's logical exposition. The next key element of a well-made play is referred to as the inciting incident. After we have the background information, we need a key moment that gets things moving, that really makes the audience interested in what happens to the characters we just heard about. So, for example, after the two servants reveal all this background information, we meet the young man, just as he first lays eyes on the beautiful young woman and immediately falls in love. This is the inciting incident. It sets off the plot of the play. Now, the plot of a well-made play is usually driven by secrets, things that the audience knows, but the characters often don't know. So, for example, the audience learns through a letter or through someone else's conversation who this mysterious gentleman is, and why he left the town many years before. But the young man doesn't know about this, and the woman doesn't understand the ancient connection between her family and his. And before the secrets are revealed to the main characters, the plot of the play proceeds as a series of up and down moments. For example, the woman first appears not even to notice the young man, and it seems to him like the end of the world. But then he learns that she actually wants to meet him, and wants to meet him too. So life is wonderful. Then if he tries to talk with her, maybe her father gets furious for no apparent reason. So they can't see each other. But just as the young man has almost lost all hope, he finds out, well, you get the idea. The reversals of fortune continue, increasing the audience tension and excitement, making them wonder if everything's going to come out okay or not. Next comes an element known as the obligatory scene. It's a scene, a moment in which all the secrets are revealed, and generally things turn out well for the hero and others we care about. A happy ending of some sort. This became so popular that a playwright almost had to include it in every play, which is why it's called the obligatory scene. And that's followed by the final dramatic element, the denouement, or the resolution, when all the loose ends have to be tied up in a logical way. Remember, the obligatory scene gives the audience emotional pleasure, but the denouement offers the audience a logical conclusion. That's the subtle distinction we need to try very hard to keep in mind. So, as I said, the well-made play, this form of playwriting, became the basis for realism in drama and for a lot of very popular 19th century plays, and also a pattern we find in the plots of many later plays and even movies that we see today. Now it's time to look at the questions. So as we go through, we're going to again refer to the 8 question types that we see on the TOEFL, and then talk a little bit about the strategy in order to answer them. Now, before we do that, we didn't really talk a lot about this in the conversation section, but it's so much more important when thinking about the lecture how the questions are going to be organized. The truth is, throughout the entire listening section, the questions are going to follow in the order or sequence of the information that they're heard. In other words, the first questions will usually involve information from the first part of the listening, the next questions will come from the part after that, and so on. It's also very likely that the first question you'll receive will involve summarizing or perhaps discussing the purpose of the entire listening passage. So notice right away in the first question, that's exactly what we see. what is the lecture mainly about? So right away, we have our first gist content question, and asking us about what is the basic idea of the reading, of the listening. Now, this brings us to a trick, and you'll notice right away the trick involves, can we distinguish between a main idea and a piece of information like a detail? Now, as we mentioned in the reading section, especially with the last type of question, the read to learn, questions involving main ideas are often tricky because the answer choices will involve wording that confuses the overall purpose of the reading with particular details you may hear. So the solution is to think about the answer choice that uses more expansive language instead of ones that just use specific ideas or details. That's often a trick. So as we look at this, let's see what tricks we can notice right away. Well, first off, let's start with B, since we do see some specific words here. French theater and realism. Now already we can tell that these were two ideas mentioned in the listening passage. Now, of course, the first question was realism even the main idea of the listening passage? Well, the answer, of course, is no. It was not. It was talking about the well-made play. B, of course, also gets some of the information wrong because it doesn't mention anything about the actual literature of realism. It just talks about the idea of realism in the theater. So in this case, we can easily eliminate B. Now, let's jump to D for just a moment, because here we see the actual words well-made play being given. Now, obviously the passage itself was about the well-made play. But of course, was it mainly about just one example of a well-made play? Well, examples were given in the passage. In fact, they do reference Romeo and Juliet. But Romeo and Juliet was not the majority of the passage itself. So notice again, even though the answer choice has some correct information, it misrepresents that information in the answer choice. And this is something we've seen before. So I jumped to those because they immediately included information that we heard. Now let's go back to the other choices. The importance of creating believable characters in plays. Well, characters were a certain big part of it, but I'm not necessarily sure that the importance was discussed, or the idea that we can even believe these characters. So we'll keep that for a moment, but we'll keep a question mark. The next one, a successful standard formula for writing plays. Now this one seems fairly general. It seems very expansive. In fact, the particular formula they were talking about was about the well-made play. So in this case, C does seem to have enough expansive language that it could incorporate what the entire passage was about. So even though it looks pretty general, and maybe the kind of answer choice that a student might actually skip, it actually is the answer to this question. Because it did talk about the fact that the well-made play was successful, and then it also explained how that formula looks. So in this case, C is our answer. Let's move on. Okay, question 21. According to the professor, why did some playwrights write the end of the play before the beginning? Well, this gets to the idea of the gist or purpose. Now, we might be able to think of this also as a detail, because we were trying to think of where we could find this information in the passage. But it also might explain the purpose of why playwrights wrote this. So in this case, we probably could think of this as a gist question, since it does kind of involve the main idea of the listening. Well, as we discussed earlier, the idea of playwrights writing the end of a play was so that they could get all the information correct in the actual order that it needed to be. So let's go through and see which ones do not represent that information accurately. First off, they talk nothing about producing multiple scripts, so this is one we could easily eliminate. In B, to prevent the audience from using logic to guess the ending, well, part of the idea is correct. It did talk about the ending itself, and it did discuss the fact that logic was somehow involved. So let's keep this one just for a moment. In C, to avoid writing endings similar to those of other plays, well, again, this is information that was mentioned throughout the passage about writing endings themselves, and that a lot of these plays were fairly similar to each other. So the question is, why would they avoid that? In this case, the if the listening passage is talking about the fact that it was a successful formula, you wouldn't want to avoid that. You would want to continue it. So in this case, C is also one we can eliminate. The final one, to ensure that the plot would develop in a logical manner, well, this one is the answer. Because at this point we can recognize that part of the idea was that the plays themselves always followed a particular formula. And that formula always kind of developed in a fairly consistent way. So in this case, D is the only one that seems even possible from these choices. Let's move on. Okay, so question 22. Why does the professor mention a conversation between two servants? Well, in this case, this is probably much more of a just purpose question than even the one before it. Because in this case, it talks about what the professor is saying. So part of the idea is to think about, why does the professor mention this? What purpose does he have? Well, let's go back and think for a moment. When did the conversation between two servants example occur? This will probably help us a lot in thinking about which answer choices we can keep and which we can eliminate. Now, A looks like a very possible choice because it does describe that these characters were fairly typical. So let's keep that one for a moment. B also looks very possible because they do talk about the fact that oftentimes people's conversations will give some information that we don't necessarily see in the play, but is kind of given to us at the right time in a well-made play. So at this point, we'll keep this one too. The next one, to explain why Romeo and Juliet can be considered a well-made play. Well, they do mention Romeo and Juliet as an example around this time, but they don't necessarily connect it to the conversation between two servants in this case, or at least that it's not necessarily the only example. And in fact, Romeo and Juliet as a play is not necessarily explained anymore after this particular example. So in this case, we're probably going to eliminate C. Now, looking at D, part of the trick here is to say, did this actual example occur during the obligatory scene discussion in the lecture? And the answer is no. It was not explained during this time. The obligatory scene part of the lecture came a little bit later. So in this case, now we have two choices, A and B. Which one is the correct answer? Well, if you notice, the part of the answer is actually contained in the question. It's talking about the conversation between the two servants, not necessarily just the two servants themselves. So in this case, the best answer choice is answer B. It shows how background information might be revealed, because it's the conversation that gives the background information. Let's move on. Okay, so let's look at the next question. According to the professor, what dramatic elements are typically included in a well-made play to help move the plot forward? Well, the very fact that it asks us to choose two answers means it's pretty clear that it's a detail question. We're looking for two details from the passage. So let's go through and see which ones we can keep and which ones we can eliminate. Now, part of it does involve the fact that we have to think about, where does it talk about the plot moving forward? Well, part of the idea was talking about how we have these kinds of things that make the plot move forward. These kinds of inciting incidents. If you recall, that's what was discussed in the video. So we have to recognize that the inciting incident is relating to that plot moving forward. So for example, the passage did talk about the fact that changes in the hero's chances of success, would they go from positive to negative, negative to positive? This would seem to be a dramatic sort of change in moving the plot forward. So we're going to keep this one for now. Now, talking about introducing new characters midway through the play, while that might be possible, nowhere is it really mentioned when talking about introducing new characters as a way to move the plot forward. Part of the idea, too, is also its predictability. So in this case, we'll probably eliminate B, because generally most of the characters would be discussed somewhere at the beginning. The next idea, information known to the audience but not to the main characters, was most definitely discussed as part of an idea moving the plot. The audience would understand through other characters, not the main characters, but through other characters. Just like we heard in the examples before with the conversation, the idea here is that we would know before the main characters would. So in this case, we'll keep this one for now. Finally, with D, the movement of major characters from one setting to another, well, it did talk about the fact that when people would move settings, that oftentimes characters would state that they're in a new place. But that alone did not necessarily mean that the plot was moving forward. So in this case, I think D will be the one that we eliminate. So it looks like A and C are going to be our best answer choices. Moving on to question 24. What does the professor imply about the obligatory scene and the denouement? Well, first off, the word imply, as we mentioned in the previous video, is referring to our ability to infer information. In other words, it's not going to be information that's directly stated, but it's probably going to be information that we can kind of guess using other words. Now, this one's going to be kind of a challenge, because this does refer to a particular detail mentioned in the transcript that we will look at a little bit later. So first off, I'm actually going to start with the answer. The answer in this case is A. And part of it will depend on the wording that we will see in the transcript. So we're going to look at question 24 a little bit later when we actually look at the transcript itself. But let's look at the words involved. The difference between them might be unclear to some people. Well, part of the idea is he did discuss the fact that obligatory scenes and denouements are not so easy to understand, and to understand the difference between them is pretty much going to be the challenge in this listening passage. The rest of them, if you notice, generally get some information wrong or misstate some things. For example, in C, it mentions that the denouement occurs within the obligatory scene. Well, we actually learned from the essay that the denouement occurs after the obligatory scene. D, on the other hand, mentions that the obligatory scene is usually less exciting. Well, again, that might be possible, but that certainly was not the intention here. Usually the obligatory scene was actually more exciting. The denouement was usually something we needed just to make things kind of logically finish. So really, if you had choices between A and B, it does seem that B would be a very possible thing, but in this case, neither is really discussed in talking about reality. So really, A is our only choice. But we will see a little bit later in the transcript where this is discussed. Our final question, question 25. Part of the lecture is repeated. Well, this immediately should tell you that this is the pragmatic understanding question. And this one's, again, focusing on the function of the meaning of something. So now listen to the part of the lecture and then listen to the question. This is the inciting incident. It sets off the plot of the play. Why does the professor say this? It sets off the plot of the play. Okay, so let's go ahead and think about which ones we can eliminate. So first off, in this particular idea, in A, possibility or not? Could it be used to help understand the meaning of a new term? Well, that's very possible, so we'll keep this particular one for now. To indicate that his point is not related to the main topic of the lecture? Well, generally the replay questions are going to be things that are related or relevant to the overall lecture, so that would be most likely not an answer choice. To emphasize one element or idea over all others? Again, that's a very possible idea. To begin to summarize the main points of the lecture? Well, part of the idea is usually the summarization occurs at the end, in the conclusion. These were definitely not words that he used at the end, but he's talking about setting off the plot. So in this case, we're going to eliminate this one as well. So of these two, which one is the answer? Well, again, part of the idea here was that the professor was trying to help understand a new term that was discussed before. So in this case, A is the answer. Now we will see, of course, when we look at the transcript, where the answer to this can be found as well. So let's look at the transcript a little more carefully. Again, we're not going to read everything that's in the transcript. You can see that there for yourself. And it is available as the quick prep download information that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. Now, again, we cannot do this during the actual test. We don't get the chance to see the transcript during this time. But you will be able, you can look at it now with the TOEFL quick prep download. If you look at below this video, you'll find the link and look for the second listening activity. So you can kind of follow along as we examine the transcript just for some helpful clues and ideas. So first off, again, notice how the script, as we mentioned earlier, will use a lot of spoken ideas to help kind of indicate that this is a real lecture. Notice they will include a lot of uhs and ums, or places to pause or to kind of change the pitch to indicate, for example, notice here, known as, plays that. We've looked at a lot of this already by examining the transcript earlier. And then notice how the professor will use certain ideas to draw our attention. For example, most importantly. Notice how this pause in between, these two little dashes here, indicate that this is where the professor would pause. So part of the idea we notice right away is that the goal is to make it seem like somebody would actually speak, not that you would read. So as we continue, let's see if we can find some more spoken conventions and try to interpret what they mean. Well, again, right away, notice words such as okay. That's very interesting. And then notice right away, well, and then the first. So first off, you might notice that this is the transition from the introduction to the body. Because when the professor says the first is this idea, the logical exposition. So, and then notice exposition is, using again a very common definition signal, and this is information that you have to reveal. Now, as we said, exposition usually came from the actors giving speeches. So, notice here, though, but for the well-made play. So already the question about Romeo and Juliet would be wrong. This particular question was talking about basically what was before the well-made play. But then here we had information that exposition had to be logical. And, of course, this is what we meant by talking about information of the play's plot, the logical exposition, or the background. So already we can see how the answers to the questions are kind of following the sequence of information in the script. Again, notice the transition to the next idea, the next key element of a well-made play. So again, notice the professor is constantly repeating the same words throughout. And then we mentioned the inciting incident. Now notice right away, after we have the background information, well, this is referring to the exposition that was talking about before. So as we continue reading, we talk about that this is the information that gets things moving. So, for example, and notice the professor uses a lot of examples and illustrations to give ideas. Now, as we mentioned in the answer to question 24, question 25, we talked about that the idiomatic expression sets off the plot is basically referring and restating to the new idea he's teaching, the inciting incident, which of course is also listed here on the chalkboard for us to pay attention to. So hopefully from that you can kind of recognize that the inciting incident is what gets the plot moving. As we continue, again, notice other types of words. Now the plot. So again, restating, repeating a lot of words to kind of keep information together. Again, there's another for example. These are, again, much more common in speaking because we need people to pay attention. And we notice a pause here. And, of course, repeating a lot of the same ideas, the woman and the young man, referring to the gentleman before. So part of the idea, too, is notice how the professor is constantly restating, rephrasing characters, and then mentions these particular people. Once again, there's the word characters, the main characters. There's the word plot. So again, much more common in speaking environments to repeat a lot of the same words or to use a kind of a smaller set of signals. For example, notice a lot of these continuing or kind of signals, but, then, so, but. These are all very common in speaking because, again, we don't want to confuse the audience, and oftentimes we're trying to connect information while we're speaking at the moment, even if this is information we know. Just like when I prepare these videos, I don't necessarily use an exact script. I usually kind of use the information on the screen and then try to talk a little bit about them as they come to me. So again, part of the idea here is in speaking, we don't often have every word planned or scripted. Oftentimes we might change directions. We notice here that the professor says he finds out, and then notice here he goes back and kind of comments on the idea. You get the idea. So this is something that he already thinks the audience knows. These reversals of fortune, the audience's tension, is everything going to come out okay or not? Okay, finally, we notice a transition again to the obligatory scene and talking about what an obligatory scene is. Generally, the obligatory scene is where things all kind of wrap up, a happy ending, and then notice of some sort. This, talking about the obligatory scene, and then notice really the definition of the obligatory scene is pretty much at the end, which is why it's called. So restating and re-emphasizing information that was mentioned before. Again, notice another clear signal, final dramatic element, and that once again the screen will change over here to include the idea of the denouement. Now notice right away how the professor will use a simplified word to restate information that was just said before. The denouement or the resolution. Now this is going to answer the question that we saw before with question 24. Part of the idea is the denouement is often something that people don't realize, that it's not the same thing as the obligatory scene. Notice what he says here. Remember, this is important. This kind of thing is drawing our attention. Remember, the obligatory scene gives the audience emotional pleasure, but the denouement is the logical conclusion. Now here's the answer to the question we saw before. The professor said that it's this subtle distinction that we need to try very hard to keep in mind. So this is the point the professor was trying to make. Many people confuse the denouement and the conclusion. So there is a subtle distinction. Subtle, of course, means very difficult to easily see. So in this case, that's what the professor was saying. So as you notice, you really have to be able to take notes as you follow along, because oftentimes this information might be part of the question. But this was kind of the basic idea. The denouement and obligatory scenes are different. And then finally, as we listened in the last time, we actually got to hear the conclusion. And the conclusion itself basically restates what was said before. The well-made play, this form of playwriting, it became the basis for drama and other plays, and a pattern we see today. Now, I really want you to think about the conclusion, because the conclusion is what's really going to connect to the very first question. Question 20 was asking about the main idea. Well, in this way, this main idea is actually kind of fresh in our minds because it actually is restated in the conclusion. That's pretty helpful. So finally, notice how we transition from the body to the conclusion. Notice he says, as I said, the well-made play. So basically going back now and signaling to us that he is going to review some of the information we heard before. And again, very short. So what are our final thoughts? Well, in this video, we discussed the academic lectures listening passages. The lectures will involve a specific academic discipline or genre. And of course, genres follow typical organizational patterns. They use signal words and ideas that we commonly associate with that genre. We also think about that we're not just going to talk about the entire genre, but some specific topic within it. So it won't be too broad. It won't be, for example, the whole history of theater. It was about some specific idea of the well-made play. And then, of course, in order to teach that topic, we have to use some terms and concepts that we associate with that topic. So keep in mind that part of the lecture will involve lots of new technical vocabulary words. Now, the lectures passage, just like we saw with the reading passages, use a lot of cohesive devices and conventions. But these are the ones that we often find in spoken contexts, not in reading ones. So these devices and spoken conventions will help to introduce new ideas, transition from one idea to the next, even emphasize previously stated ideas. So, we also learned that the lecture section will follow a general sequence. It will have an introduction for about 30 to 60 seconds, a body about 4 to 5 minutes, and then a very brief conclusion, the final 10 to 20 seconds. So when preparing to take notes, it's really important you think about this sequence as you get ready to listen. Finally, let's kind of review the idea that we talked about taking notes really involves the active listening process, which is very similar to the active reading process. For example, we talked about paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is especially important when listening because you're going to have to do it a whole lot more. The idea here is you're trying to write down important technical terms just as you hear them, but then also writing down other ideas in your own words. And that's important. When the text is giving us technical terms, we need those words. But then oftentimes, if we need to write them in our own words, sometimes that's often very helpful because it keeps us more involved. Now, noting key details and ideas, especially ones that are repeated or rephrased throughout, but we also notice that it's not writing down everything. That's part of the idea of active listening. We note the key ideas, but we can't transcribe them. That would be too difficult to do. So as mentioned before, there are a lot of great materials out there to prepare for the test. Again, the TOEFL website, which is where the prep download that we've been looking at today comes from. The official guide to the TOEFL test by ETS. And then our new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, which can be found at the bottom of the video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 3, Academic Conversations and Review.